I'll begin by saying I have a special feeling for St. Augustine. Augustine is a spiritual idol of mine in a way, although I'm not an Augustinian. But like me, St. Augustine was a prodigious sinner. And he was a smart guy. He was a great rhetorician. And he loved learning. And he sought out experience. And he had a lot of experiences. And a lot of those experiences were experiences of sin. And Augustine, again like me, I don't like insincere sinners. Augustine gloried in his sin. He never said it wasn't fun. He came in his maturity to know that the wages of sin are death, and that those sins he committed were actually wicked in hindsight. But he never denied he had quite a good time as a sinner. But ultimately, he also, when he wrote in his confession, he didn't confess his titillating sins. He didn't glory in it anymore because he saw that it was wrong. What did he confess? He confessed to stealing some pears. But in that confession, we see the roots of sin. Because as a teenager, Augustine was a rough kid. And he ran with a rough crowd. We might even say, like today, that Augustine was a gangbanger. He had a gang of friends, and they would go around committing crimes. And the gang, one day, they saw a beautiful pear tree full of pears. Didn't belong to them. They didn't know who it belonged to. But they saw this tree full of pears, and they went and they stole the pears, and they fed them to the hogs. Didn't even eat the pears themselves. And Augustine thought about this, and he said, now, we didn't have anything against the tree's owner. We didn't know the tree's owner. Said we weren't hungry. We didn't eat the pears anyway. Why did we steal? And they stole, he concluded, simply for the pleasure of stealing. He stole because it was forbidden him. Such was my heart, O God. Such was my heart, which thou didst pity even then in that bottomless pit. Behold, now let my heart confess to thee what it was seeking there when I was being gratuitously wanting, having no inducement to evil, but evil itself. Augustine is confessing to God that he stole those pears. He did a lot more than steal pears, but as he said, he doesn't glory in sin anymore. He gets the message across with what seems trivial. But he stole those pears. He did that evil for evil's sake. And we see Augustine, St. Augustine and St. Paul, both recognize that there are sinful inclinations in the flesh. But neither Paul nor Augustine separate the flesh from the spirit. Sin is not a simple conflict between mind and body. It's not the mind warring against matter. It's not our spirit warring against our flesh. Because the spirit and the flesh are actually inseparable. This is what we talked about earlier with the breath of God that enters and animates. The soul is an animating principle. So our entire being, what St. Paul and St. Augustine are saying, is our entire being is infected with and corrupted by sin. We are not only inclined to sin with the body, as against the mind. So we know something, what Paul is talking about is we know something is good in the mind, but we sin anyway with the body. But that's not the only way it goes. What Augustine is talking about can also be sinning in the mind, which is what Christ talked about. Sometimes we withhold from sin. We withhold our flesh from sin. We don't go and commit adultery in our bodies, in our flesh, but in our minds. He that lusteth after a woman in his heart has already committed adultery with her in his mind. So this corruption of sin permeates mind, body, spirit, the whole of the human being. Thus, Paul says in our reading of Romans, for the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. He's describing something that we've all experienced. And like I said, you don't have to go with these big glorious sins. Just think about the times you've done evil for evil's sake. Think about the times you've said something that you knew would get under somebody's skin. And you knew it. You knew it in your heart of hearts and your soul of soul, and you still did it anyway because you like that poking. That's evil for evil's sake. You got nothing out of it. You knew you shouldn't do it. Did it anyway. So Augustine goes beyond Paul in that he doesn't only point to the times we do evil despite wanting to do good. He acknowledges too, there's a lot of times we do evil just because we like to do evil. And that is tough. That is tough to hear for a lot of modern day Americans because we are Pelagians by nature. We tend to believe that we were born sinless. And when we do sin, it's because we didn't know any better. Or because, we're just human. We're imperfect after all. It's okay. We rationalize it away. We just didn't know any better at the time. But neither Paul nor Augustine buy this excuse. And this is why Augustine tells us about the pairs. And this is why Paul is often given this undeserved reputation as somebody who doesn't like the law. But no, Paul explicitly says the law is good, holy, and just. We need the law to show us how depraved we are. We need the law to show us when we do evil for evil's sake. The law is a gift from God, given in love by God to keep us from deluding ourselves. Because left to our own devices without a law, we make excuses. We say, I didn't know any better. And Augustine and Paul, they don't buy this. They say, no, I stole those pears. I did evil just to do evil. I needled that woman just to do evil. Just because I enjoyed it. That's original sin. And that is a dogma of the church that is self-evident and empirical. You can go outside and you can look. If your eyes are open, your ears are open, you're going to see sin. We all fall short of the glory of God. It doesn't take much introspection to see that we often do evil purely for the sake of doing evil. And when we're confronted with God's law that tells us not to covet, that's when Paul says, that's when our lust for evil is inflamed. But that is also when we are rightly ashamed. So the law serves a good purpose. It shows us where we fall short of the glory of God. It clearly shows us our sin. It clearly shows us our wretchedness. Clearly shows us our wickedness. However, the law also shows us God's love. And in showing us our love, the law shows us our salvation. For the law condemns us only so that we can see the love, the divine love of God that saves us from that condemnation. This is why Paul says, and says rightly, the law is ordained to life. Why then do we find the law to be unto death? We see that death entered the world through sin, and we suffer because we see this. And we are the only creature that suffers in this profound existential ways. Animals live in a fallen world. They suffer. They have fleas. They get hurt. They get sick. They die. But the animal doesn't suffer in the way we suffer because the animal doesn't know that a world without suffering is possible. And the animal doesn't know it's going to die while it lives. Our blessing and our curse is that we do know. We know we're going to suffer. We know we're going to die. We find this sin, suffering, and death everywhere in the world, but also we have that God-given intuition because we were created in the image of God, that God did not ordain death. God is a God of life and of living. Death is something that entered the world in a primordial event in what we call the fall. It is not the way that God wants things to be, and it is not the way God will allow things to be. We know that God will redeem us from sin and death, and that creation will be restored to its original perfection. So the law shows us also what can be. And we are to play a part. The law tells us we're to play a part in this story of salvation. The law has been given to us out of love that we might know how to play that part and see where we sin, where we fall short. And indeed, we fall short. Let none of us deny it. Our suffering, this suffering we're born into from the day we take our first breath, that's the human condition. We are trapped. We are born into and we are trapped in a world of sin and death. And we cry out like Paul, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death?" But as Christians, we know the answer. And the answer is, of course, Jesus Christ, who came not to abrogate the law, but to fulfill it. To show us how to observe every jot and tittle of the law, and to empower us by his grace to go beyond mere scrupulosity. To go beyond scrupulosity in following the law in our flesh, and to go beyond it by doing more than the letter of the law requires. We are to observe the law with all our being, because the whole of the law is found in that commandment to love God and neighbor. So law is not opposed to faith. Law is not opposed to love. Law is the means by which we are taught how to love God and neighbor, how to follow that greatest commandment. Jesus shows us that the law is love, and he gives us the power to love the law, because the law is given by God's gracious action and his faithful love. And it is ultimately that love of God, not the law, that saves us. But that love of God saves us not despite the law, but in conjunction with the law. So let us go forth today in love with God and in love with God's law.